know about you, but it sure seems to me like the Beatles and their legacy just keeps getting bigger and bigger all the time. Now, of course, I know the Beatles anthology, Now and Then, Get Back, Let It Be, all that stuff has a lot to do with, promoting their legacy, promoting the Beatles, keeping the Beatles in the news. That's obvious. And obviously, Paul and Ringo and the estates, they all have a hand in that. That's what they want. But it's so funny to me that back in 1970, that's not what they wanted. They just did not set out to do this. They probably couldn't imagine like their 2020 selves there back in 1970. I mean, who can? But being a Beatle was definitely the last thing on, John, Paul, George, and Ringo's mind. They wanted to just move on from it. They just wanted to be John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And they did a pretty good job of that, in the early 70s. But even then, it was hard for them to escape, being in the news all the time because, they were having their diss tracks and they had all lawsuits and, they were being interviewed all the time.
Have you met the Beatles at all, the other members?
Yes, John, I have.
Have you talked to them about getting back together again?
Yes, John, I have.
Do you think they're agreeable?
Well, I don't know, John.
You had the records out. They were always in the news. And it was always, Beatle John, Beatle Paul, Beatle George, all that stuff. It was always like ex-Beatle Ringo, all that in the news. So they could not escape. And of course, Ringo did the Ringo album with everybody on the album. So, around that time, they probably said, okay, we're just going to maybe be Beatles every once in a while. We'll just do it to help out Ringo. But then after a while, they said, okay, well, maybe we can say, all right, well, maybe we'll think about it. It's not out of the realm of the possibility that we might get together.
No, I say, it's just one of those things. If it happens, it happens.
So they were talking about that, with all kind of caveats around it. They're just nowhere near going to say we're going to get back together or maybe we will or this can. No, they probably were never going to get back together most likely. And if they did, like John said, probably just going to do it in the studio. And maybe they would have done that. That's a possibility. But they really were shy about being Beatles because of all the mania. And I think that's obviously like partially why they broke up. They were trapped inside that Beatle bubble and they didn't want to go back in there. They were out, they were free and say, we're not going back in there. And so that's probably why they were running so hard and trying so hard to get away from that Beatles and the legacy. It was always chasing them. But then, of course, like the legacy and the Beatlemania, it all kind of, caught up to them in not the best way there in 1980. And then, of course, renewed interest, in 1981 on because we lost John. And so they're not really asking, hey, you're going to get back together again. They're not, that's kind of gone by the wayside. But renewed interest is there, about the Beatles because the Beatles, they were finding out, oh my gosh, they've got a great story. So people began to find out more about the Beatles and their story and want to know what, Paul, George, and Ringo were doing. Are you guys going to show up together? What are you guys all up to? So there was all this renewed interest. And of course, they had their records. And of course, in the 70s, they were fairly successful in the 70s. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, good run for them, for all four at one time. Pretty good. And then in 1980, it was a bit of a mixed bag, just like it was for a lot of other, artists in the 60s. But then they were definitely finding their feet. They were trying to say, okay, maybe we're Beatles. They did the 1987, the Sgt. Pepper 20 years ago today special. At least, Paul and George appeared in that, where they were not quite embracing or promoting the Beatles, but they didn't appear together, but they were in the same show, kind of talking about the same thing for like a few minutes. And they were at least admitting, talking about the Beatles. Yeah, we were the Beatles. And this is what we did. And part of what we did was pretty cool. And then, of course, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. And then more and more attention, and they're promoting it. And then in the early 90s, of course, Paul starts touring in the 90s. Again, it's doing pretty well. George does a couple of live concerts here and there, and they're playing more Beatle songs, more Beatle records. And, maybe I did forget to mention there, Paul and George, they did those John Lennon tribute tracks there where they were, embracing. I think they actually did probably embrace being a Beatle and actually kind of embracing each other with those John Lennon tribute songs here today, as well as all those years ago. And then, of course, George did that When We Was Fab thing. And I like George's attitude. I think, by the time the late 80s were coming around, they were all saying, okay, fine. All right. So George was saying, okay, fine. I'm just going to lean into it and be kind of jokey about being a Beatle. And so that's where they were there in the early 90s, beginning to say, okay, maybe we can sort of be okay with being a Beatle and embrace that a little bit, because they did have the Long and Winding Road project, going on. They were working on that. But I don't know if they were really thinking at that point in time that it was going to be such a big deal all over again there in the mid 90s, with the 1995 anthology and all the releases and everything. Maybe they did. I don't know. Now, I mean, they were going to light that match again. Did they know what they were getting into? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But prior to that, they did release the Red and Blue albums on CD. George Martin, he has this little press conference or this event at Abbey Road Studio, and George Harrison makes this surprise appearance there. Okay, so George even is kind of leaning into it and having fun with it. George is always going to be jokey about it. He's not going to be serious about, being a Beatle. He's always going to kind of joke around that. And you can see that in Beatles anthology, George just kind of keeping it real.
He was always 9 months older than I. Even now, he's still 9 months older than me.
And that's great. We love George. And then I think in the late 90s, they really did begin to think about actually promoting the Beatles actively. Definitely the Beatles anthology was promoting the Beatles. All of that absolutely was. But I think that they might have been doing it semi-reluctantly. But I think that it worked out pretty well for them. It worked out better than what they thought. They had a lot more fun than what they were thinking. They liked working together again. And they said, okay, well, I guess we can be Beatles. And of course, Paul does the Flaming Pie album, all very reminiscent. He's in that mode of the Beatles. And George does his thing too. George befriends the founder of the Cirque du Soleil, and George kind of inspires him to create that Beatles Love show. Now, George did not survive to see the show opening, but that show is largely due to George. So George was definitely interested in promoting the Beatles legacy. And of course, Paul was always doing his part, I think especially as he goes into the 2000s, into the next century. And he kind of evolves into who he is right now, being the biggest Beatle fan ever. And Ringo was doing his thing too to promote the Beatles and their legacy. He formed that all-star band in 1989, and he began to sing With a Little Help from My Friends. Now, it started off small, with a little help from my friends. And then, over the decades, over the past, 35 years, now it's this huge anthem now. This little song, With Little Help from My Friends, sung by Ringo, has turned into this huge anthem of like love and peace and friendship, and of course the Beatles. And, everybody quotes it all the time. It's very quotable. It's easy to sing. And it just makes you feel good all over. It's almost like Ringo has kind of taken that all you need is love vibe and everything is going to be all right vibe and made it his own, which is exactly what he did. He's got that peace and love campaign now. So he's promoting that Beatles vibe, that it's all about love vibe. That's what Ringo is doing and slowly doing over the years. And even in 2010, Ringo started singing Give Peace a Chance. He added that to his set list. He started saying, John's Give Peace a Chance. So, I mean, that's just very touching right there, where Ringo is taking a John song, not making it his own, but definitely growing John's legacy as well. And of course, John is connected to the Beatles and making it bigger than it probably ever would have been. Ringo's doing his thing, growing the Beatles legacy with the Give Peace a Chance, with a help from my friends, on his tours, touring every year, growing that. Everybody loves that, getting new fans on board with him because he's so lovable. Okay, I'm telling you, everybody loves Ringo. And so he's just attracting all these new Beatle fans in the legacy. He has that. And then also Paul, of course. Now, Paul did something very unique. Paul really embraced the Beatles legacy. He had that when he went on tour and he did that duet with John Lennon, that I've Got a Feeling duet, that was kind of a transformational moment. It really was. To see John Lennon up there on that big screen and Paul McCartney right there, it was very impactful, just kind of jaw-dropping. It really, really was. Very emotional, and making everybody want more. Paul really knows what he's doing there. He really does. And of course, he has the Eye of the Storm book. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, I can't name everything because I don't know everything because there's just so much now. It just seems like the Beatles is just growing and growing, almost has a life of its own now. I just think it's kind of funny that back in the early 70s, they were running away from it. The Legacy kind of caught up to them and said, hey, man, you're not going to run away from being a Beatle. And they said, okay, fine, we're Beatles, but we're just not going to talk about it too much. I'm just going to kind of put it over there. I'm going to try to ignore it. Maybe it'll go away. And then in the 80s, they realized, hey, man, it's not going away. I can't ignore it. So at least I'm going to pay attention to it a little bit. All right, I'm going to admit I was a Beatle. So they're all kind of doing that, and they're all fine with that. And then as they get into the 90s, they say, okay, well, maybe it's not so bad being a Beatle. Here we are, we're Beatles. This is great. Let's do this. Let's make a little bit of money here, like in the 90s being Beatles. And then the late 90s, they said, all right, let's not just make it be about money. We like the Beatles now. We're good with the Beatles. They just started to really push it and celebrate it and grow it in their own way rather than the Beatlemania kind of habit. Beatlemania was in the interest in them. It was that was the boss. Now the Beatles did take charge. They said, this is our story. We're going to do it our way. We're going to celebrate it our way. And I think that's kind of what happened, in this century. Is Paul and Ringo kind of took more charge of their legacy and began to promote it their way, the way that they wanted. And, with the release of the books that they had, the photographic books, all the memory albums almost, and making everybody more and more interested in the story and more interested in the music, and promotion of the new movies and everything. And they're celebrating it. Now they're all Beatle fans. They love it. And Paul and Ringo appearing more and more together. It's just been a journey. It really has been. And it's been pretty good for Beatles fans. I'm super grateful, super thankful. It's a really great time to be a Beatles fan. I think any time's a great time to be a Beatles fan. So anyway, thank you so much for being here with me today. I really and truly appreciate it. And until next time, peace and love one another. Take care, you all.
Beatles is Beatles are Beatle, 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 Beatle. In the end, it's like, oh, sod off with the Beatles,